Joyce Mitchell, nice to, well, I can't see you, but nice to have you here.
Thank you.
There you are.
Okay.
Long time no see.
It is now 8:30. We're getting started and we are recording the breakfast. Welcome, everyone. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay College and director of the Dispute Resolution Program. This is our 237th breakfast since 9/11. I think we're getting some background noise here. Can everyone mute till we have the interactive part? Thank you. So these breakfasts were started.
Maria, you've been muted.
Yeah, Maria, you're now on mute.
I think she might have been lost.
Who's
We're all muted. Maria, you're
muting
muted.
me? Okay,
Now we can
Sorry.
hear you.
You're there, Maria.
sorry about that. So once again, this is the 237th breakfast since 9/11. Until March, we met in person at John Jay College, and it was great to see everyone over bagel and coffee. Starting last April, we had to do our virtual breakfast format, and it appears as though we will be continuing this format for the immediate foreseeable future. On Tuesday, CUNY was informed that we will be meeting in person in the fall. We haven't heard yet what arrangements they're going to make for large gatherings. So stay tuned for future developments on the future of the breakfast. The committee that works on the breakfast will also be following protocols to see what, if any, arrangements in person will be made in the near future. These breakfasts are co-sponsored by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College. These breakfasts are also planned every month by a wonderful team consisting of Julie Denny, Chuck Newman, Matthew Latimer, Nikki Brofsky. It's great to work with them every month to make sure that we are here on the first Thursday of the month. At 8:30 Eastern time, we often get asked to switch it to some other time to accommodate all the time zones around the world. And we've held pretty firm to being on Eastern time here. This morning, we are like super delighted to have with us one of our colleagues from Canada, Cinnie Noble, and Julie will do the introductions. Thank you so much, Cinnie, for joining us, and take it away, Julie.
Thank you, Maria. Before I introduce Cinnie, a longtime friend and colleague, I wanted to tell you that our Muslim author Sabia Riemann and Jewish journalist Walter Ruby, who both spoke together at our breakfast several months ago. The topic was "We Refuse to Be Enemies," and their book has now come out, and it's available pretty much anywhere you buy books, local bookstores, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Kindle, and hardcover. So any of you who are interested in that, go find it. It's called "We Refuse to Be Enemies." So now to Cinnie. Cinnie is a former lawyer. Cinnie, normally we say a recovering attorney, but anyway, a former lawyer with a master's of law in dispute resolution, a professional certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, and also a certified mediator as a member of the Academy of Advanced Practitioners at ACR. In 1999, after extensive experiential research, Cinnie developed the CINERGY model of conflict management coaching. She provides her coaching framework worldwide, And she and her team also train mediators, facilitators, coaches, lawyers, and others all over the world in her unique model. Cinnie is the author of 2 coaching books, which I think she will post on a screen sometime during her presentation. One is Conflict Mastery, Questions to Guide You, and the other is Conflict Management Coaching, the CINERGY model. And after 9/11, Cinnie was retained to be part of the TSA Integrated Conflict Management System, where she designed and implemented a peer conflict management coaching program. She also initiated and co-hosted the Conflict Management Coaching Community of Practice for the International Coaching Federation and the Conflict Coaching Special Interest Group for ACR. Cinnie's going to divide her talk into 2 parts. The first part will be principles and practices for one-on-one coaching. She'll break at the end of that section for any questions, which you can post in the chat, and we'll facilitate that process. And then she'll resume talking about coaching as a pre-mediation tool. So that's my story. Cinnie, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I want to express thanks to you, Julia, and the rest of the team with Chuck and Nikki and Matthew, and of course, Maria, for your leadership with this. And I'm really delighted to be here. I've got a lot to tell you about. And before I get into the use of slides that I have today, I thought what I would start with is to give you a little context about how and why I got even interested in the idea of coaching. So I'm going to use conflict coaching interchangeably with conflict management coaching. They are the same kind of concept. So if you hear me use either of them, but I thought that it goes back a long time that it just piqued my interest that there might be something else in our field that was needed. And it came up from a couple, I would say, 6 or 7 times I was faced with something where I thought, there's something else that's needed here. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of those to explain. One incident happened. So my background was in family mediation. I was a family lawyer and went to family mediation. And then when I did my master's of law, I shifted a lot of my practice into workplace related work. And I ultimately started to do more interpersonal disputes within the workplace, investigations, facilitations. And it was there that I was exposed more to something which is applicable in any context. But so one of the instances was I was in walking into a bank where I had done a lot of mediations. I was on my way to do another one, and I ran into one of the parties that had been in a mediation about 3 or 4 months before. That little exchange, how are you doing? And she said, oh, good, I'm so glad we got things sorted out. I'm actually, I don't think, we'll call her Mary, was all that happy that I initiated that mediation. I said, what are you talking about? Well, she said at the time, and she said since, you didn't have to bring in the boss, you didn't have to go to HR. We could have sorted this out if you would just come to me. And I said, well, what's that about? She said, well, I wished I had. I didn't feel very confident to say something. I kind of avoid conflict. And so that was sort of one thing that was there. And it started to build as I ran into a number of other instances. So another one that was pivotal for me was I was going to go to another place for mediation. And I got a call from the HR person who'd arranged it to say that one of the parties decided that he didn't want to go to mediation. Would I come in and talk to the other party? And so I did, and I didn't know then what I know now, but essentially worked with her around her doing something about that dispute. And surely many people don't want to go to mediation, or someone doesn't show up. And here's another opportunity with one person. What are they going to do? And so that stuck in my mind too. And then I felt like I needed some other skills. So as time went on and a few other things happened, the one that got me interested in coaching happened when I was doing a workplace investigation. And it was a complaint against a manager, a new manager. And there had been a complaint about him fairly early on, and about his avoiding conflict. And the organization had sent him off for conflict management training. And then that didn't seem to have many more, a strong enough effect, because then there were 2 more complaints about trying to get things done and that he seemed to be avoiding. And so they decided to have an investigation about it. So I interviewed all 12 of his staff members. All 12 said, look, he's a really good guy. He's new at this. You know, there's a lot that he's doing that we like, but he avoids conflict. So anytime somebody wants to bring something up to him, he runs away from it. He's short with it. He seems to get tense about it. And so we're not getting decisions made. So I was talking to a colleague and I said, you know, the man's been through conflict management training. My job is to give some recommendations. Feels like it needs one-on-one work of some sort. She said, oh, have you heard of executive coaching? And in my world of hearing about coaching, prior to that, coaching was always one of those things that you'd say people needed counseling, or it was punitive, a more remedial frame around it. And as I started to look into it, which I'm going to share with you, I started to see that there was this different way of looking at coaching in terms of a developmental frame. And also a frame that was around, some people just want to be a better version of themselves, and how do they get to do that? So I'm going to open up my slides now and to talk a bit about this from a little bit more. And can everybody see that? We're good? Good. Okay. So I'm going to talk about applications, principles, and coaching, and give you examples, a lot that I would like you to know about. And you're going to learn more, including the model that I put together, how the process is used. And as Julie said at the beginning, I'm going to just talk about the one-on-one idea of it, and how it works and how I use it. And then I'll go into more about how it could be used in mediation. The slides are going to be available for those who want them, I understand. So I will move ahead to tell you about what is coaching. So the International Coaching Federation is one of several international coaching organizations. To me, it's kind of the mothership. It's probably the biggest. I'm certified through them. And they have had in place since the 90s. So when I inquired in the late 90s about coaching, when my colleague raised it, they were at embryonic stages. But they have code of conduct, they have competencies, they have a really rigorous program of becoming certified. And you can get more information on their website if you are interested, but it's its own discipline. What struck me, though, so this wasn't the definition at the time, but it was similar. And what struck me around it was around partnering as a beginning. So it is, you as a coach, you work as an ally with your client. You are not impartial. You are supporting them. And thought-provoking and creative process, this is around self-discovery for clients to figure out what it is that they want and need to do to maximize their potential. And when it came to conflict management coaching, it's about their maximizing their potential to be effective when they're engaged in conflict. So on that foundation of the definition, these were the points that were then and now. And you're going to recognize some of what's here, because they're some of the principles that go into conflict management around discovering and clarifying, aligning with what the client wants to achieve. This process is very goal-oriented. Coaching is about what's the client hoping to achieve? What is it that they're wanting to work for and work on? Client self-discovery, really self-determination being a huge premise. Client-generated solutions and strategies, that language. And the fourth point about holding the client as responsible and accountable, the coach's responsibility is very much around, is the client making progress? Are they getting towards their goals? And so a lot of accountability is built into this process. So if we take it to conflict management coaching, there are a number of definitions out there. Conflict management coaching is, so it's one-on-one process that I'm talking about. You can do group coaching. I'm going to talk about one-on-one today. So it's supporting clients to gain increased competence and confidence to manage and engage in their interpersonal conflicts and disputes. So really clearly around people wanting to be the best they can be, to participate the best they can, and to figure out how to do that, what it is that they need in order to be that best version of themselves and to maximize their potential. So I want to tell you a little bit about how the process works before I go into more detail, because I think I like to preempt some of the questions that often come up. It's a conversation. It's an informal conversation with the coach, and in the process that you're going to learn about from mine is the coach is leading down a process, but really in more a very conversant way. There is intake and contracting like there is for other processes. I use a contract that is similar in some ways to ones that you might use in mediation. The International Coaching Federation says you don't have to have a signed agreement, but you do have to make sure that the client is aware of the roles and responsibilities of the coach and of them, which is what you're going to learn more about today. So there needs to be clarity that it's voluntary, it's confidential, and that the process is very much aimed at what the client is wanting to achieve. So you're going to hear me say that a lot. It's around goals that people have. So intake and contracting all happens before you actually start to coach a client. And that it is typically them being able to identify why they're coming in the first place. Some people are referred for coaching by their organization or other sources, or they self-refer. And so I know a question is going to come up about, how voluntary is this if somebody is being referred to coaching? I think that the process of how coaching is introduced in organizations, and if the developmental frame is on that, what I can tell you over the years, this would not have been the case 20 years ago when I started. There has been an increase exponentially of coaching in organizations, particularly, where there's an expectation. If somebody goes to HR and says, look, I need some coaching, that's an expectation. It's a coaching culture that has grown, and particularly in North America, but I do training work and coaching work in other parts of the world. And very often people who are from, for instance, American companies who are transferred to other countries in the world, that coaching is common there as well. It is a pervasive view at coaching is part of leaders developing. So it's not as unusual as it was 20 years ago to introduce the idea of coaching. And so when people are referred, it might be because they're not doing so hot at something, but the way that the coaching works is to be able to talk to people about what they're going to gain from it. You cannot force somebody to be coached. So if they don't want it, they're not going to be there. But over 20 years, I think I've had one person who said, I don't think this process is for me. Most people will get into it. They may not like that they were referred. They might see it as remedial. However, the way it's introduced in organizations and with the coach is one that is meant to put the frame on it about strengthening skills. It is confidential. It's not privileged. So coaches could be called on, so could their notes. So that's always a conversation to have within an organization. However, one of the important pieces about this, there's no time that a coach would or should go back to the organization that's referred them and report on. You don't provide written reports and you don't provide verbal reports. If there's any reporting, it's done with the client. That's a very strong ethical provision through the Coaching Federation. The process is conducted so way before Zoom. I have done, one of the things is coaching's one-on-one. So I was using phones and Skype and other kinds of platforms. Some clients don't want to be seen. They want to sit in the privacy of where they are, and they don't need to engage in a face-to-face. They just want to concentrate on what it is that they're thinking about. That's not an unusual thing to happen. It can be in any kind of forum whatsoever where the person is being on a one-to-one basis. Duration and timing. I do different kinds of conflict management coaching. One is around disputes, which in my dream, when I started this, I thought, wouldn't it be great if people would go to coaching, conflict coaching, because they wanted to strengthen their skills. And the starting point is, I always get defensive when I'm criticized, this is what I do. And they want to work on certain of their conflict dynamics. That isn't actually very much that happened for a long time, although it's increasing in my practice. Typically, people wait until a dispute has happened, or they're in the middle of it before they seek some kind of coaching. So under those circumstances, the duration and timing is, it could be 6 to 8 sessions, it could be longer, it could be less. Sessions are typically about 50 to 60 minutes. In research that I did, many people said, the majority of people said that after about 50 minutes, they'd had enough. In coaching, you're asking people to look differently, think differently, reflect differently, and it's a lot to take in. You're tapping into different parts of their brains and their thinking processes. And so that period of time is 50 to 60 minutes is max for a session, I find. And it could go as long. So when I'm retained, I will say it is between 6 to 8 sessions. It could be longer. We'll reassess. That would be a typical thing to say. You as conflict specialists, no matter how you're doing your work, have got a whole range of skills that you'll be able to use in coaching if you take it up. And I know that some of you, I see some of you, and thank you for people who engaged me, who are people I've trained, that you will know that many skills come from what you already do. I would say that some of the strongest skills that coaches learn that are a little bit different, we learn in the ADR world about questions, open-ended questions, how to frame powerful questions so that people think differently is probably the biggest skill that I've learned. And I love questions. I'm fascinated by them. And I'm going to give you a gift around questions later on. I'll tell you about that. The idea really is around learning skills. Some of the things that you don't do because the other person is not in the room, and you're just dealing with your client, is you do not need to do summarizing of what everything that a person says. Often that's a second kick at the can for the other person to hear and to hear it neutralized. There's some things that people shift in order to wear the coaching hat. So mediators who take up coaching will wear their mediator hat and use certain skills, and you learn different skills in coaching and wear that hat at the time. So I had been a mediator, and of course there were some challenges to do that. But once I learned it, I realized that there were different ways of being in a one-to-one with clients. So I'll move on to emphasize. It's goal-oriented, it's future-oriented, and it's results-oriented. People are making progress to reach what their goal is. And I'm stressing future-oriented because it's not unusual for people to ask questions like, isn't this therapy? And people who don't know therapy or counseling might ask that question. There's still stigma for people around having counseling. And so when I'm asked that question, it's really around firstly finding out what is it that concerns you about that, because there might be some worry that people have around the fact that they've even raised it. But it's future oriented in that there's not a time. If somebody said to me, oh, I can just see I'm behaving like my mother, she was a tough taskmaster, here I am doing this again. you would not go back and explore mom and that situation. It would be around, what are you trying to do differently? How do you want to be? It's getting people to identify the future, the re-scripting of what they don't want to be to being what they want to be. The results-oriented part goes to, of course, the idea that they're held accountable for moving ahead within the process. And the coach is going to be examining that and checking in with the client at each session around their progress. So I want to give you the applications and context of where conflict coaching fits in. While I mostly do workplace coaching now, I don't always, but it's applicable in any context when somebody is wanting to be a better version of themselves. I use that expression again in many different parts of conflict. So before conflict could be when somebody is anticipating that as soon as they tell the other person a situation, that there's going to be a blow up, and they want to be prepared to handle that, to say what they want to say, to be able to respond to it. And some of the cases, for instance, in the workplace, I have a case right now with a manager who hates giving performance appraisals, and at the best of times, but knows that with certain people that am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. So want to be prepared because this manager is expecting certain responses that he wants to be better prepared for. And so that would be before conflict is thought of. It's really by way of preparation. So it could be for anything. That another situation I had not all that long ago was a manager who wanted to present a situation, a new policy decision that was being made and knew there would be pushback. Wanted to be prepared for that. Finds that she isn't typically very calm when that happens, becomes defensive, trying to learn a different way of being in those situations. So during conflict, there are clients that come because something has already started to derail in a situation with somebody, and they're in it and they want to figure out how to prevent it from escalating unnecessarily, how to handle it more effectively, how to get focused on what's important. And so that would be a during conflict. After conflict are the kinds of situations that come up when something is already blown up. It may not be reconciled yet. It may be reconciled for one, but not the other. The client comes and it's unreconciled for and says, I'm still feeling lingering stuff. I don't feel very resilient. I feel like I want to go back and say something. Dealing with the after effect, the agonizing for many. I sometimes have clients that'll come say, I'm still wishing I'd said X, Y, and Z, and I'm still wearing it, and I need to do something about it. And so some of that is what might happen in coaching around people being able to get under it and to figure out what will this mean for going forward. Sometimes they may go back and talk to the person. Sometimes they start to think out, this is the sort of thing that triggers me. I need to figure out how to handle this better. And the last application I want to refer to is conflict competence. This is what I'd said to you earlier, is that my dream was that wouldn't it be great if people came and early on in any situation around before conflict is going to happen, that people, and this is particularly because of my work with leadership in organizations, is that many new leaders get into those positions and they can do the job, a lot about the job, but they don't know how to manage people very well and are not communicating well and dealing with conflict well. So conflict competence has to do not with a specific dispute. It's typically when somebody comes saying, I always get defensive when people take me on about things, when I'm feeling criticized. Some identification of something they already know that they don't do very effectively, and they want to be better at that. So those cases usually last a lot longer. I have some clients doing that have been 6 months, and those are often people who are new leaders. They are in the face of conflict all the time. for the 1 week it's having to speak to the board and getting ready for that. Another time it's the fundraisers. Another time it's having to make some decisions that are going to not go over well. It's a lot happening. So they might deal with the situation, how they're going to be, and then come back over another situation. I have clients that have called me, I saw them 2 years ago and new situations come up and they're not feeling very well equipped to deal with it. So those are the kinds of contexts that this is before we talk about premediation. These are the types that are individual, one-on-one. And the idea really around coaching, as I've seen it develop in my work, is that we all have our idiosyncratic ways of managing conflict. We all have different ways that we do it. And when people identify, or it's been identified for them that it's just not working, then it's another tool for people who work in the conflict field to be able to provide a process that are for those who want to work on those things. So I want to tell you about the research that I did that, it's not moving here. Wondering why there we go. All it says is research. I did a lot of research around this because when I learned about the field of coaching, and the International Coaching Federation had no specialties. So they have specialties, everything that people learn when they take coaching, life coaching or business coaching or executive leadership coaching. There are these broad coaching models, but there are many niches, many specialties. And conflict management coaching is one of those. Could be food coaching, weight loss coaching, marketing coaching, all kinds of niches that people have developed. And when I was looking at this, there was no model at the International Coaching Federation that was operated by somebody who is a coach and that had to deal with conflict. And so I did some research. The basic framework that happens in any coaching model is essentially a person can tell you where they are and where they want to be, and where they want to be is the goal. I want to be more effective as whatever that is. And in coaching, it would be anything from I want to handle certain disputes better. I want to be more effective. The sorts of things that I've always told you about. But the basic frame is, here's the client at one end, and this is where they want to be at the other. And the coaching that gap is what coaches do. And the way to do that is, in order to do that in any coaching model, is if people have the same brain and mindset as they do when they come in, the role of coach is to have people start to think differently about whatever it is they're wanting to work on. Because no change can be made unless there's a change in the way people are thinking and feeling about a situation. So in order to move from where they are to where they want to be, it's looking at what different perspectives might they have. And once they have that, to look at what kinds of options do they have? What sort of action steps do they need to take? And what will get in the way of them moving ahead on that? That framework is what I used in my research. And I met with many people over time to see what it would take. What would be a way to move people along a continuum that would be problem solving? And what I looked at were the various principles from conflict management, from coaching, and from the neuroscience. So I'm going to touch on all of those. There's a lot to say about all of them, but I want to make sure that you get some of the basics. So my background is conflict management, and of course I'm going to look at things like exploring what's going on for the client, what it is that is driving them, what's the dynamic that's driving them, what's going on for them emotionally around it, and also we use the self-determination principles in conflict management, and so that's really an important piece of it. And I also wanted to make sure that the principle of how might people step back and look at the situation from the other person's side. So those were the conflict management principles that were probably some of the most important ones that I brought forward in how am I going to make sure to do that within this model. There are many coaching principles, one of which is self-determination, and others that I looked at. In the coaching world, there's a lot of emphasis on the idea of self-awareness, that how to build people's self-reflective muscle. So they start to look more at what's going on, that they are, what's happening, what awarenesses might they raise, and not only about what's happened, but what they can do about something. And so a lot around the idea in one of the philosophies in the International Coaching Federation that I really liked is that for coaches to effectively be there for clients, it's important to treat them and to think of them as creative, resourceful, and whole. And that adult learning principle concept around people are able to, my clients are adults, have got a lot of experience. They've got a lot, they've observed a lot, they have a lot to draw on. And by looking at people as being creative, resourceful, and whole, and being able to do that, then we're not giving advice, which is a no-no in coaching. We're not there to tell people what to do. That's not where learning takes place. Learning takes place by having people dig deeper, look at what it is that they want, what they want to do differently, how they're going to go about doing it. So those are some of the coaching principles. The neuroscience ones, I had started to study neuroscience in a number of different ways. And there's, we have got some people that have written great, interesting articles and books on neuroscience. And looking at it from a conflict point of view, a number of things that I really wanted to take into consideration in designing a model had to do with focus, because the part of one of the many things talked about in neuroscience is how to focus the brain and what is needed. So that's very much around the goal and keeping people focused on what it is they're really trying to achieve. What's the outcomes that they might want. Other ones are in the neuroscience has to do with they link to the other principles around self-determination and doing that, shifting the mindset, what is needed to be able to have people think differently. And essentially, I saw a lot of my reading seemed to apply to how to shift people from reaction to reflection to response. And reflection is that place where a lot of the work is done in coaching, but in neuroscience that would talk about people building insights by spending time on what might they become aware of that they didn't know before. And that's where the questions come in. So those are some of the basic operating principles that I looked at in trying to figure out how to do that. And so I tried a lot of different ways of taking that coaching model that I told you about, that framework. And so I played with it. I tried different ways of being with people, all kinds of experimentation to see what was it that moved people along a continuum in an incremental way to be from where they were to where they wanted to be. So I'm going to go over briefly. I want to make sure that you know what the CINERGY model is all about. It's of course quite detailed, but I just for the sake of understanding the steps that I looked at that ultimately were successful in shifting people from where they were to where they wanted to be. So again, the starting point is clarifying the goal with the client. And that starts early on and work with them to, what is it you want to achieve by the end of our time together, essentially is what you're asking. And so that people get goal oriented using their brain. What's my goal? It becomes the focus. It becomes the coach's focus. This is what the client said they want to achieve. I inquire about the situation is finding out what happened that, led to that person wanting that goal. The end stage, name the elements, is the elements of the conflict. This is breaking down the conflict, deconstructing it, if you will. And I use a construct called the not-so-merry-go-round of conflict, which was created out of research that I did on how people tell their conflict situations. And it was a matter of breaking down the elements so that people started to look at, what was it that triggered them and what does that mean to them? What values underlie the reasons that they would get triggered? It's an extensive construct that really is the different perspectives part of the coaching model, where people start to gain insights, self-awareness about what really was going on for them and what they observed that was going on for the other person. So the end stage is an integral part of whether or not people are able to step back and dissect what happened for them and what the dynamic was with the other person. The E stage is then, once people have done that, they typically start to shift by that time to start to step back from it, and they start to look at what their choices are of going forward. Often choices are action, what they want to do about it. It may be a conversation. It might be that they don't want to do anything. It may be they want to act differently around the person. There are all kinds of ways that people look at, how do I want to be that's different, that's going to reach the goal that I want. The R stage is then reconstructing, and that is, it might be practicing, it might be rehearsing, it might be people putting themselves in the situations and trying different ways of being around the other person. It's really, I think of the first part of the model is, so the CIN is breaking it down, and then you start to put it back together. How are you going to be going forward? What is the change you're going to make? How is that going to be? And the G stage is what'll get in the way of you proceeding, and why is when and where and how. It's really solidifying what the actions steps are and when they're happening. In fact, I do a Y type stage at the end of every, so you're not going to get through 7 stages in a session. It takes that's why it's 6 or 7 or 8 weeks of building on what the person's goal is and how they're going to get there. And their goal could change once they start to look at it further. But at the end of every stage, every session with somebody, there is a kind of a why stage. Where are you at now? What are you going to take away from our time? And usually some kind of a task that people want to work on before the next session. It keeps the momentum going. It's a process, as you can tell. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes sticking with a way of problem solving, starting with, let's look at the goal and how you're going to get there. And the coach who learns this will learn the kinds of questions that are going to work to start to move the person along the continuum. So remembering this, that going back to some of the goals that people have, just so you get the kind of idea around action, it might be just to figure out what to do. Some people just go because they want someone like to talk to about it and hear themselves out and decide whether or not they want to do anything about it at all. And they'll explore that. Performance appraisal, I've mentioned that to you. What to do about an unresolved dispute. So something has happened and do I want to go back about it or not? What my options are, what am I going to think about? And then there are the ones that are more behavioral in nature, to interact less defensively, to be less accommodating, and preparing for hard conversations and to speak up and better manage pushback. These are just some of the kinds of goals to give you an idea of the nature of what is an action. I'm going to just give you a few examples of coaching cases, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. But I want to give you examples of a few that I have had in the recent past and are ongoing, so that it'll put a little more context even on this idea of it. So while I do mostly workplace, I don't always, and an example of one that I think is an important one to raise is around a woman who is the eldest in a family of 4 siblings. She is the sister who is looked up as sort of the elder in the family and the mom when mom is not around. Mom now has dementia, and the family is going to have a mediation about what to do around winding up the home that the mom has lived in by herself for many years, whether they're going to bring someone in the home, whether they're going to go into a nursing home. all kinds of decisions, and they're going into a mediation about that. Sister came to me, however, because she said, I know they're going to look at me a lot. I tend to facilitate a lot of discussions that we've got, and I do not get along well with one of my brothers very well, and he pushes back all the time. And I want to be better prepared in that mediation about how I'm going to handle some things. And I also want to think through some of the options that are coming up before I get there. So it was preempting the mediation. The mediator may or may not have worked with some of them individually. She didn't think the mediator was going to, and she just wanted to have some time to think it out. Another case that I have that's been relatively recent is a new lead of a nonprofit organization. And he is meeting with the board, and in meeting with the board has many, he has been told that he has to stop being so defensive, that when they raise issues, they are not criticizing him. And it's come over and over again. And one of the people on the board said, you may want to get some coaching about this. And that's what I'm coaching him on. And so his goals are essentially around, I want to be less defensive. I want to identify what that is. I want to figure out other ways of responding rather than getting angry, which is what I do now. So those are just two examples. I do want to tell you before I open it up is that the whole idea of conflict coaching and who would be interested in it does extend in many organizations, but the ideas, since I told you earlier that the concept of coaching cultures isn't unusual, but conflict's everywhere. So whether you're in a university setting or a workplace or doing family work or elder work, whatever that is, how people can be in conflict is critical for people who come. That's the underlying motivation, that people want to be better at what they're doing. So to keep that in mind. I do want to add too that this coaching model has been used in various parts of the world. It's not specific to North Americans that the model works. It was tried and has been used in many cultures. And what makes it different, what's different is some of the language might be different. So for instance, looking at, instead of using the word trigger point or the words trigger point, in some cultures that language wouldn't work. And so people just adapt to use whatever is suitable. But the concept of moving is one that has been adapted easily to other cultures. So I'd like to open it up now to questions that are coming in, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. And then I'm going to go into premediation. So do I have some questions? I see I have quite a few questions.
You have lots of questions. Cinnie, one of them was, how could you clarify again grounding challenges?
Grounding the challenges is the stage where the person has decided what they want to do. They figured out how they're going to do it in the R stage. They're ready to go. And the question is, what will stop you from proceeding? It's not a question, if the person has really looked at all their challenges and what they're concerned about in the R stage, it's not a question that resonates for some people who are ready to go, but for some people who say, what if they won't speak to me? What if I send them an email and I don't get a response? I'm a bit of a procrastinator. So it's checking in with people about, is there anything else that you need to look at before you proceed that might stop you from doing this? Sometimes people will say, I'm actually feeling a bit afraid about something that I didn't raise before. And then there's more coaching about what that fear is about. So people get in a momentum and they're moving ahead, and then they might just have some trepidation about it. And that's what's addressed.
Another question is from someone who took your coaching training several years ago. She says, we all modify our practices over the years. I'm interested in your process and what changes, modifications you tripped over and made in the course of your own personal growth.
Well, Actually, a couple things occurred to me about that. So the model has been the model. It hasn't changed particularly, I would say. I think that within the course, I talk much more about the neuroscience, and we talk more around what you're looking at in the stages from the brain point of view. You know, what I would like to tell you from my own practice, though, because that's one of the questions at the end that kind of struck me is, one of the things that happens in coaching that did not happen for me in my mediation practice and still doesn't, since I still do some mediation, is a lot is built on reflective practice for coaches. It's checking on how to remain the ally for your client, how to work on yourself. You know, and many of you would know, I think Michael Lang is here today, has written a book on reflective practice for conflict managers. In the coaching world, we spend a lot of time on reflective practice and I'm in a peer group. I've been a peer group for like 6 years, and we meet every month. And some of it is looking at if you were having challenges, what things we want to work on. And I would say that I try to encourage that a lot more within the training and afterwards, that we really are, it's a privilege to coach people. And it is a privilege to mediate people as well, and to look at how do we be the best version of ourselves. And so I've seen more in people who mediation training who are looking at themselves differently too, about how they can make that shift. So, and if there's other things, the person who inquired, if you want to directly write me at some point, I don't know that there's anything different from when you took the training, since it hasn't been, changed incredibly, but to be in touch.
15 years ago, Cindy, 15.
A long time ago. I'm not sure there's anything different from then, but there might be. So contact me if you'd like. For those who take the training, I have a monthly newsletter, and so there might be things in there that would be worth looking at.
Okay. Could you talk more about how you name the conflict and deconstruct the conflict? How do you get the person to honestly open up?
Right. So that's a really good question too. When you're working one-on-one, one of the biggest parts about learning coaching anyway is around how do you build rapport and trust. How does a client know you're not going back to the organization? You need to tell them that. It's building a relationship right from the beginning. But of course, people don't necessarily know who you are. Are they comfortable? Do they want the process? I didn't choose you. There can be a lot of pushback around that. And so some of it is how you relate to the client and building that rapport and spending a lot of time on it. Before you even get to the stage where you're doing that, you will have spent time in intake. You will have spent time exploring the situation, being there, being empathetic, being caring about the person. And when it comes to the stage that breaks it down, it is really based on habits that we have in conflict. And there is some neuroscience behind the trajectory that we go to, which starts with when we're triggered. And I find that by explaining to people, one of the things we're going to do is to break down the conflict, and it's based on how most of us think what happens to us when we're in conflict. And so it's a matter of asking questions about looking at each sort of place that you went to, and taking it as a more technical, practical. It's a common thing that when we get triggered, we start to react, and to get people to name those things. And there's some neuroscience that says that when people actually name the emotions, that it starts to minimize some of the energy that's gone into the amygdala. And so some of it is by actually getting people to name it. I find in this process that I do very little talking. Other than asking questions and taking the client through, that putting things back to the client, rather than me reframing what I hear, asking the client to name what their experience is very different. And so taking that kind of approach for going around the merry-go-round, around people getting to break down what's gone on for them, is different when it's done in that kind of methodical way. And so it's easier to get people to name it.
Great. One person would like you to expand on the difference between coaching and counseling.
Coaching. So when counseling has got a huge, different ways that people look at counseling, but often counselors are looking more at blocks that people have, dysfunctions that they have, and what to, and sort of vetting those and looking at and exploring more about the roots of those. Because coaching is a much more future oriented, it's about taking people to what do you want to do about it. If people stay in weeping about background, being upset about it, if they cannot move from that, then coaching may not be the place for them. There are people who aren't coachable on many different levels. I've had people that are in coaching and are also in counseling and therapy for issues that may or may not be related, but in coaching, they're dealing with, what am I going to do about this? But if they're stuck about moving ahead, then they might go back to the therapist before they're ready to proceed. Or we work in tandem that they're working in coaching. So there's a real difference in it being a very task-oriented, future-oriented, results-oriented process around doing something, taking an action, as opposed to counseling. I would say that there's some like solution-focused therapy and cognitive behavioral have some kind of, there are things that might be seen as being similar. But I would say you would not find in a counseling where you go step by step by step in this kind of methodical stage. It really distinguishes it.
And one more question, and then I think you're going to want to get on to part two. Do you ever work with youth?
With
young people, youth?
With youth. I don't, but I have trained people that do. And there's no reason that it cannot be used with people who are I wouldn't even say, I don't even know what the youngest age would be, but I do know people that have worked with teens, and I know I don't know younger than 12, if I can say that I know, but I think that it's feasible. It's probably changing the language around it, but it is a methodical process that could be used to focus people down. I think to remind people to hear about it's focus on what the person, an action. And when one of the questions is often asked is, how do you know when someone isn't coachable? Besides the fact that they're unable to move ahead, people who are unable to take action, like there's something that would be, they'd be stuck around that. They're probably not ready for it. And there's lots of tools that you learn in coaching around this. But some people just might not be able to move ahead.
Okay, back to you, Cinnie.
Thank you. Great questions. So I'm going to talk about premediation coaching. I'm going to define it here. I use prior to joint sessions to prepare each party. And also it could be used in caucus. When I was writing the book on coaching and including a part on premediation coaching, I know there was a lot of literature out there around about bias. And I can remember speaking many years ago around premediation coaching, and that was what came up. Would you get biased if you spend time with both parties? Well, in one-to-one coaching, you're very vested and very much the ally with the client. In premediation coaching, you're the champion for both of your clients. And being careful about how you approach that is really critical to making sure that they don't think you're telling the other person something. So that's set up from the beginning. Excuse me. I'm getting dry from talking. So why premediation coaching? How did this come? And I think there's a little backstory here that's important as well. Besides the situation that I told you about, where the person that I met had said, I wish that I had, been better prepared, or if I did it, I could have done it. I could have done this on my own. It started to occur to me that when people go into mediation about interpersonal disputes, is that very often, most often, they already know what the other person's going to say. They've heard it. They might have heard it many times. They might have seen it written. They might have been told by their boss, their HR, their lawyer, all kinds. And so it occurred to me that maybe there was a different way. So I want to start this by saying I do a different process now around interpersonal disputes that I want to share, because I think it matters that how people are in the process starts before they get there. And that's what led me to start to think about, well, what does that mean? So I went to organizations that I had worked with as a mediator, and I asked if I could interview people who had been in mediation, not necessarily people that I had mediated. It could be anybody, but I want to do some research about did they need other preparation before going into mediation? And so I went to a number of public and private sector organizations where I had done interpersonal disputes. I also contacted some family people that I'd done in family mediation years before and asked if I could interview them. And so I interviewed a number of people. And there were some common themes that came out of people going into, who went into mediation that were about preparation. And they had to do with, I wanted to be better prepared to say what I wanted to say. It was in my head, but it didn't come out the way I wanted. It was about, I knew that I'd react. I knew what he was going to say, or she was going to say, they were going to say, and I wanted to be able to be cooler, hear it, because I know it was coming. I want to be able to respond better when I hear the things that bother me, so that I'm not going to just burst into tears or fight back. So it was a lot around preparing people to be in the process in a different way. And so that led me to think about, well, is there something different that I could do here? And how would that look? So I'm going to give you some idea around what that would be. I would say, unlike coaching that could be 6, 8 more sessions, I have done 2 to 3 sessions per person. When it's high conflict, it's been longer. You know, the expectation that people who've been in high conflict for 12 years are going to figure this out really quickly is pretty unrealistic. And whether it's high conflict or not, it seems to me that there's a high expectation on people to be in a process when there's so much that's gone on and going on for them. So because of, if they're not getting coaching, so the ideal world, each person has their own coach, they've worked out, they come to coaching. That's expensive. I have been in situations where that's happened. But if you're the mediator, what can you use around coaching in order to prepare people? So 2 to 3 sessions, and the focus is on what people are most concerned about. And I'm going to give you an idea of what each session for me would look like. So it varies a lot, but I want to give you an idea about that. And they're preparing them for their specific concerns, and mostly about setting intentions. So while you might be in a coaching session with people where they actually get to rehearse it with the coach on the one-to-one where it's not mediation related, here, if you are the mediator, that's not where that's a line that gets crossed about getting into it too much, but you can get people to set intentions. So I'll give you an idea of what all of that looks like. So again, the common goals are deliver messages they know will not be well taken, to receive hard messages, and respond and interact. Remembering that they already know, in most interpersonal disputes, what they're about to hear. And people can tell you the 2 or 3 things that they're most concerned about. Sometimes in pre-mediation coaching, they are saying, I've got to figure out what my options are. And so that's a task for them to do, and look at the pros and cons for them and the pros and cons for the other person. In between sessions, there is something for people to work on. And that is usually led by the client. That's why it's a little bit tricky to be able to say, this is how I do it every time. But I want to give you sort of an idea of what that looks like. So coaching in the mediation context, it really is starting with people getting focused on what's important to them. So prior to meeting with them all together, I will send out something. It depends on how much information is in front of me, but I will say something to the effect, I'm going to hear, what's brought you to mediation, And what I'd like to ask you to do is to give 3 points of what's really important, things that you really want to make sure I hear in all of that. Someone says, well, it could be, it's only 2 or it's 5, it doesn't matter. But if you just, start with a number, it's 3 things, so that it starts to focus people before I meet with them, that they're starting to look, what's really important that I want the mediator to know about. And I also ask them before they come is, what are the outcomes that you are hoping for the relationship and for the issues? So they're doing some work before they ever get there. There could be a lot of other kinds of things that I might include depending on what I already know, as I mentioned. So that when I first meet with them, I do explain the process to them, that there's always a bit of time that's spent there, but most of the time is on them. It's all about them getting prepared. And so I find out, what happened, and they have a chance to vent. You can use your mediation skills around all of that. I want to go back a step to just explain something there. One of the things around that is about the brain, and that is that when people go into why I've shifted what I'm doing, is that it seemed to me that when people go into a mediation and as soon as someone talks, the other person is reacting, and there's been conversation and articles around that. But it's hard to stop the person from not reacting and their amygdala being on fire. They're hearing what they already heard, and they're hearing what makes them angry. And how might people be able to be reflective and think and problem solve and be creative when that's spiked, when the amygdala is spiked? So the idea of getting people more prepared, and so asking them early on, which probably a lot of you would do anyway, what outcomes do you want for the relationship and for the issues, is partly the conversation. So I explain the process to them when we meet so that they get more settled. That's what most of us would do in any case. And I listen to what it's all about for them. And I empathize, and I ask them what the impact's been for them. And I ask them, what don't you know about where the other person's coming from within that session? So it's the gaps that might be existing. You can tell that I'm kind of a gap person. There's something missing. What could that be? And so we have a conversation that might take, the 50 minutes, meeting with people for 50 to 60 minutes for 2 or 3 sessions. And so that whole conversation that includes the process and them talking about it. And I'll say, what are the 3 main things you wanted to make sure I hear? And what I found about doing that, I'm not quite sure where that came from, but I felt that instead of me summarizing what I heard, it would be helpful to hear what they would say was important to me. And it isn't always what I might have said or thought. So it's really getting them to focus on what they really want me to hear about. And some of it has to do with, I'm really nervous about when Joe says this. I don't know about how to say this. It's the kind of the lack of confidence that people are having about being in a process. So what I do then is ask people to work on something for the next session, and depending on what it is. And when people say, I ask them, what are, in that first session, what are you most concerned about? And then I will, for their task between, is to focus in on that. What are the concerns? And what is it that they think needs to happen for them to be able to overcome that, to be able to participate effectively? And so that can take a different form depending on the question, but some of it is really around making sure. And typically what's happened is they come back with what I said to you earlier. I know when she says this, I know when they do that. It's that reaction that people are concerned about. So the next session is going to be around what is, we commonly talk in the coaching world about setting intentions. And that is around getting people to look at. So if someone says, I want to find out, I've got to get a better way of saying what it is that I want, because I know that I always say it with such anger. And so setting intentions means, so what's the message? Focus in on what message is. What is the, how do you want to be in that? How do you want to be seen? What is the tone of voice? It's asking people to contemplate it. Again, in coaching, if they had their own coach, they'd actually practice and play those things out. I have, to some extent, done that with clients in premediation. I'm just always conscious of making sure then I'm not coaching them about what to say. You never do that with coaches anyway, manipulate a conversation to be the way you think it needs to be. And by this time, you're going to start to hear what the other person's saying. So it's always important just to keep it in a way that is asking people, what do you intend? And what does the person, how will that person hear that best? So they start to make more concrete what it is they're wanting to do and what the messages are. And then I revisit before the third session, if there's a third one, anything about your outcomes that have changed, and what is that to think about, and what other intentions do you want to make sure, what has this raised for you about what you want to make sure that you're prepared to do and prepared to receive from the other person that you want to be prepared for. So it's all about people actually identifying, focusing, being ready to go into a session. I tell them at the very beginning, that when I meet with them, that I'm not telling the other person what they're saying. And it may be in caucus that I'll say, what can I tell the other person about this? But at that juncture, it usually isn't carrying it to the other person, going back and forth. I have done it when someone said, could you please find out this? But that isn't normally how I would do it. I would normally say that this is all your time for you to get prepared. I'm doing the preparation for the other person. So it can take on different modes. What is important around this, though, is that how I do it differently when we meet is, rather than having one person start, without some preparation, is I say to them to write down the 3 things that they want to make sure the other person hears and knows. And it may, and again, they might say 2 things, 5 things, but the starting point is that they are, in fact, reading from, if they want to, or just saying what those things are. But they're looking at saying it in a way ask them to look at how will the person hear that? How will the person hear that? And then they figure out how they want to say it. I don't manipulate it. I don't say this instead. They are thinking how the other person is going to hear something. And that's how we start our time together. So a lot of different moving parts here, because I gave you sort of some of the basics that go on. It's working with the clients differently without crossing over a line where you are conveying in some way what the other person might say or not say. So that's a lot to consider. And I'm going to ask, I'll open it up for questions.
There's one question right here regarding pre-mediation. Please clarify, you conduct 2 or 3 sessions with each before bringing the parties together?
Yes, 2 or 3. And now sometimes it's budget driven in an organization.
Yeah.
I will tell you that mediations usually, where they've had pre-mediation, it usually take less time. When I first started mediation, it was interesting because way back when everything started, and there was this theory about 3 hours or 2 hours or day long. And I thought, well, where does this ever come from? And so some of it is working with the client. So I try to make it more a joint sort of decision making around 2 or 3 hours at a time, so that people can be there. If the budget allows as an organization to be 3 sessions, I'll say 3 sessions to start with. If somebody after 2 says, no, I've had enough, or I think I got it, I'm okay there, then that's fine. But I like the idea of 3, because I have found by the 3rd one, people are getting clearer on what they want to say and what they think they want to be most prepared for. And they get just more prepared to, I guess, to calm themselves and to be ready to participate.
Someone says that she uses a convening process herself to prepare parties to mediate effectively. But she'd like you to talk about, address, expand, how do you manage perception of neutrality if one of the participants seems to need more pre-session coaching sessions than the other? And 2, you've said you don't do it, but how about this pre-session coaching sliding into a conciliation process with a little shuttling back and forth? This is a long one. Informing your work in the private sessions and moving the participants forward as part of the mediation prep, and then mediate?
That's a great idea. There's no reason why you couldn't do that. I think that's a really great way of starting with people and bringing them together. That makes total sense to me. And so I have done variations of that actually. And so I think that's a great idea. I didn't get the first question though. There's two there.
Right. How do you manage the perception of neutrality if one of the parties seems to need more counseling, pre-mediation
Coaching.
coaching than the other?
It has happened. What I say to the parties is, that I have 3 sessions or 2 sessions, whatever the organization has said. Most organizations that I work with now are fine with the 3 sessions. If I say 2, 3, so they budget because they've seen there's been a shorter time of mediation, and we this is all stuff to talk about with organizations to see. But part of it is to the idea of preparing goes over well with organizations. So one party might say, I'm cool after 2. And so if I have the time, then it might be seeing the other person. They don't know how many sessions I've got with the other person.
Yeah.
So it works out, as it will. I think, and the party who might get 3 sessions and the other one 2 is not knowing the other one isn't getting 3. If somebody says, I need more time than this, and the other party isn't ready around that, I need to go by what's been allowed by the organization, what time I've got. So it doesn't really become an issue, but mostly it's, what do you need more time to do? What do you need to do? It's just working with the client to prepare. I'll tell you that I find it quite interesting that people get really well prepared. Whatever I've asked people to consider, or I ask them, what do you want to work on before we meet again? I always start with that. And then I'll say, well, this is where we're going to go next. People do it. It's rare that someone hasn't put their minds around it.
Mm-hmm. When you're coaching pre-mediation and there's an attorney present with the client, and the client's thinking could be different, influenced by the attorney, how do you help both?
I do interpersonal disputes and the attorneys are not present.
Yeah.
So that's not, I have had a number of union reps say, what is this stuff? I want to go, like, are you doing my job? And I've had union reps come and stay and they just are hands off. I've not had anybody interfere. I've had people say, okay, I get what you're doing. And they want to make sure I'm not stepping on their toes. But I'm not sure what around with the attorney, what I would do around pre-mediation coaching. It's interesting because I've thought about the idea that many people who go into mediations when they have their attorneys might want to say more, do more. And in fact, one of the first clients I had when I started coaching at all was a client who said, I'm going into this is when I did court-connected mediation. And the client contacted me and said he's going into a court-connected mediation and his lawyer wants to take over and say everything that he wants to say. And he keeps trying to say, I want to say certain things because that person was I went to my MBA program with him and I want to be able to talk to him. And so the coaching ended up being what he was going to say to his attorney and what he was going to say when he went in. I think there are probably lots of occasions where people would like to do that, but I guess it's adapting as best you can what to do about that. Helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to something we've already talked about. How can you be a champion for each and then mediate afterwards? There's some question about that neutrality. Can you maintain that neutrality after you've spent 3 hours with each of those parties? Or
so I think it's kind of owning it. Some of this is style. We're so used to being in a certain way, and I think that I made a shift around this, which is to say to the parties, independently when I meet with them, look, I'm the champion for both of you. I want this to work for both of you. So I want you both to feel as best prepared as you can. And then when I meet with them, I'm saying, I'm here, as you know, I'm your champion. I'm here to support you in this, how it's going to work. If you want a private meeting, well, all that, the usual stuff that you would say. So I think it's kind of how I have maybe reframed how I come across to make it work.
One person is asking if you ever use this in a divorce context.
I have not, because I haven't done family mediation for a long time, but I've trained a lot of family mediators who are using more of the coaching principles and preparing people. There's a classic, right? People know exactly what the other person's going to say. They're coming, it's and fired up about it often. And so I did coach a gentleman recently who was in mediation, not with me, family mediation years ago, when he and his partner sorted out a joint parenting arrangement. The person who approached me is moving, and he knows that his partner will go back in mediation, but he wants to be prepared for what he knows is going to be some pushback about what he's going to suggest. He wanted to look at his options. So he wanted to have this conversation before he went and approached the other person and went into a mediation. Nothing that I have anything to do about. So I have coached people going into mediations who want to be prepared for different kinds of dynamics that they expect. So certainly there have been people, it's interesting in the family world where coaching fits in, because it does fit in to prepare people to be in mediation. It also can be used separately from people who are trying to deal with separation and divorce and how their life is going to be. So those people who are, there's a whole field of coaching. There's people who do divorce coaching around people getting focused on, their life after. So I think there's a real, within the family mediation setting, however, I think there's a really good case to be made for people being prepared in a different way than we might otherwise do for what they want to say and how they want to receive.
I'm not reading all the compliments, but you should know lots of people are thanking you and saying this sounds great and they're going to use it, and
Oh, good. Thank
so
you.
on and so forth.
Good.
Here's another one. Great concepts. Thank you. I have done coaching in different contexts as needed. I understand it is not about therapy per se, but I have seen that sometimes people have triggers that are unconscious and involuntary, i.e. a boss who reminds them of their father, and responses become out of their control until it is recognized by the client. How would you deal with this? Send them back for counseling?
It's another great question. So remember that I said earlier that if people say, it's just like my father, my mother, it reminds me. And if the question is, how are you going to be different? What do you want to do differently and get people focused? If they keep going back there, then the questions, one of the skills I've learned in coaching is around naming it. To move ahead in this process, I have a process to go ahead with the goal that you've got. Sounds like you're stuck here around this, or it sounds like you're there. What do you need to do to get past that? Maybe this isn't the process. So it's really putting it back to the client. I don't easily, sometimes it's just saying that when people say, no, never mind. I just can hear myself. I don't want to be that person. Well, who do you want to be instead? So some of it is just having that conversation. I am not quick to send people to therapy. A lot of people will be upset. A lot of people will cry for the first few sessions. I've had clients cry through all of it. Once people start to see themselves or think about themselves in ways that they don't want to, they can be upset about it. That doesn't mean they aren't appropriate for coaching. I think there's something therapeutic, though not therapy, about coaching, in that people, you've got an ally, you've got somebody in your corner who's there trying to support you and get you through the process. And so I think some of it is just listening to that. I've had people who've repeated for 1 or 2 sessions, oh, there I go again, that's my father. Okay, so where do you want to be instead? And just keeping the eye on the ball. And I think it takes a lot of time before people shift. I had a client who said, who kept saying, oh, there I go again, there I go again. And I thought, okay, so every time you say there I go again, I'm going to ask you to think about, but here's where I want to go. or and here's where I want to go. And he got into the habit of doing that. So that, and then he stopped altogether. So some of it is working with what's in front of you. One of the reasons that I don't want to send people off necessarily, unless they really can't move and they identify, I just, I can't get past this, is that people often feel embarrassed at first, kind of like admitting not feeling so good about themselves, their part that they played, who they were, and getting comfortable with that and not sending them off or suggesting something. And people who come who have felt rejected by being told they need to go to coaching, for instance, then they don't need another rejection. So it's working with people.
Okay, where is it? Fahad has a blue hand raised. Fahad, you need to unmute yourself, or Chuck, perhaps you can do that.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. And this was wonderful. So thank you for, explaining all of these details. I just had one question, and this is related to work conflict, that how do we resolve if there is a difference of approach towards work? Like one is more professional towards accounting details that need to be done to run the organization, and the other party is just like, don't value it enough and don't think that that needs to be done extensively. Then how do we resolve, like, approach towards work more than the personalities to resolve and to, move forward? Because otherwise it would affect the organization in how you operate it. And it is a 501c3 organization, so the requirements are there. So how do we resolve that, please, if you can advise? Thank you.
Right, so this is for mediation. Firstly, we can't change people. And so Cartley is looking at being able for people to identify, if somebody has a certain way of doing, some of the conversation in pre-mediation coaching would be about, they want me to be like them, or they want me to change. And so, it's going to be hard to find a common ground about how they can work together. It might be much more of a workplace decision or policy decision about what to do. So can you mediate it would be the first question. And so I think part of it is having people to look closely at, what do they see as the difference, and have them in pre-mediation look at what kinds of things are going to bring you two together, given that you operate very differently. If that's what you're told, if that's what they're told, I don't know the backstory, if they're told different things from the beginning. So some of it, to me, a lot with mediation is it mediatable in the first place? And if it is, what is the expectation? If the organization is setting the expectation on what is expected from both parties, then that needs to be clarified somehow, somewhere along the line, because two parties coming in, not knowing what there's to do, how might they manage that? So if they're told in advance, you've got to figure out a way to work together, then that's the conversation. Given that you operate differently, what pieces of what you do can work, what pieces of what, I would have that kind of conversation, have it in advance with people. I don't know if that answers it. It's hard without all the details, but also I think it's how do you get people to start thinking what responsibility they have in it, and it's probably what you do anyway in a mediation. But if you have them prepared in advance to think about, given that you're diametrically opposed to it, what parts of what you do might they be interested in? Might they look at? How could you work together? I think it's a challenge to figure that out when people have certain styles. It's not something coaching can change.
Yes, and also if they're both on the same, like if they're both founding board members. So it's like the organization is made up of those people and they're running the organization. Okay, thank you very much.
There is another question. Not sure.
Julie, I'm sorry, while you're pausing, Cindy, did you want to put up some more slides about contact information and booking?
What I was going to do, sure, why don't I just do that? I wanted to make sure that if you want to get the second chapter of my book, Conflict Mastery Questions to Guide You, it's a book that contains before, during, and after scenarios. And after each of them, like it might say blaming, it'll talk a bit about blaming, and then it'll have 12 questions afterwards. And these are good ones for clients to work on as well, that can be done between sessions if what they raise is something that is pertinent from the book. So the second chapter of that book, it deals with before conflict. And it's a long link there. So you can go to my site, which you would have given on the information about the CINERGYcoaching.com. Under resources, there are a number of free things. This is one of them, but for this one, you need a password, and it's Get Free Chapter, and you can download that chapter.
Get Free Chapter.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, great. Also, your contact information has been put in the chat.
Okay, that's good.
So
That's how to get hold of me. These are the books.
And it's back there again. Yeah.
Okay, we're good.
So there is one more question, and then we wrap up the formal presentation. One person has asked more than once, if you're dealing with a very strong, politically strong person who refuses to come to mediation, how do you deal with a conflict in that situation? I think that's what this person meant.
Can I explain that?
Yeah, Anapan Sangi, sure.
So I want to explain that the person is not inclined to pay up, or is not inclined to take over the liability, because the person is strong politically and therefore not scared of the law in a place like Nigeria. So is there a strategy? Is there a strategy that can bring people?
Yeah, take it, Cinnie.
Yeah. So firstly, coaching is voluntary, and so you can't force somebody to do coaching and look at things at all. So if the person was game for looking at one-on-one, but in that instance, I don't see how or why they might be. The other person might want different ways of coping with it, or getting them to the table, or I don't know if they would go for coaching. But it really, remember, it's goal oriented. What's the goal? If the person has a goal, so the person who's so politically strong might say, my goal is to have my way. You're not going to, that's not coachable. So it's, if you want something to work, what could happen here? What could you talk about in order to make that happen? So it may be that, it's the same thing. And some people just are not, I sometimes think that we need to, in the coaching world, that we think someone needs coaching, but if they don't think they need it, then they're not going to participate. And it's how to see and what to do. It does go to marketing of coaching. And the whole idea of developing a field of to do coaching is, how do you make sure that you get appropriate referrals, and not people who could care less and say, go take your coaching. That's not something I'm going to do. So it's how you're going to introduce it to organizations and how it's looked at. So the political person in this situation may not think there's anything to develop other than people going along with what he or she thinks needs to happen.
I'm just going to bring up one more thing.
Thank you so much.
Emotional flooding. There's been a lot of back and forth about the concept of emotional flooding from Ariel Lublin. And I don't know if you want to comment on that. She's volunteering to start a Zoom meeting on that subject alone, but I wanted to share that.
I don't know if it's within the context of one-on-one coaching. People do all their emotional flooding with the coach. Typically, that's you're on one-to-one work with them, and are they flooding if they need to? Often people are able to move on. Often people who come to coaching have told their story at least 10 times to people, and so some of the emotion and the facts are what's developed. They say what they wish they'd said, and so sometimes it's, how do you focus? One of the ways of focusing is what I suggested earlier around focusing the brain. What's the most important things of all that? What are the 3 emotions that you would say you're experiencing right now? Getting people to name it and to slow down and to look at what it is in a different kind of way. So before they start to ramp up, how might you grab it and say, or before we meet, here are some questions to think about. We'll talk about them. It's the best I can do
That
right now.
wraps it up. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how many people have thanked you and
Oh, nice. Thank you.
applauded and said they're so glad they heard you, or they worked with you earlier and they're glad you're back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you a ton.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. And
Brava.
with that, we are officially adjourned and we are going to turn off the recording.